My name is Sean Prentiss. I am the author of a memoir called Finding Abby and a memoir and poems called Crosscut. I also wrote 2 textbooks right here, and I put together 2 anthologies. And The Science of Story, that bright blue one, is where today's talk comes from. And it also comes from an article that was published in the Writer's Chronicle. All right, we can switch to the next slide. We're going to start out with a group activity. What I'm going to do is, if the technology works, we're going to push a button and a clock is going to count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And at 1, you all are going to close your eyes. You can't open them. If you open them, you ruin it. And what you're going to do with your eyes closed is you're going to count for 30 seconds. And while you're counting, once you get to 30 seconds, you'll open your eyes. It doesn't, it's not going to work. I don't have internet, so yeah, it's nope. No, there's a clock. Oh, dang it. All right, so I'll explain what I was going to do. Without internet, I can't get it to work, but I was going to have you close your eyes and count to 30 seconds while a clock counted up to 30 and beyond. And what we discover is that some of you would be great with counting to 30. Some of you would count way too fast, and you'd get to 15 seconds, and you'd think it'd be 30 seconds, and you'd open your eyes, and you'd say, I'm terrible at counting. If you're like me, I just did this to myself the other day. I opened my eyes, and the timer had stopped, which meant I went past 1 minute. So I'm terrible at this as well. The big key here is that we'll talk about time in a second, but we're all, for the most part, terrible with time. We're really bad at knowing how long durations last, and we're bad with a bunch of other things. And you would think that's a negative, but it's actually a positive for us. So just imagine we did it. Just imagine most of you were pretty bad. Imagine some of you were pretty good. Congratulations, great job. And now we'll move on. So the article I'm going to talk about comes from the Writer's Chronicle, and that's what that is. And what we're going to talk about first is we're going to talk a little bit about brain and time science, so neuroscience and cognitive science. I am not a scientist, but I did some studying of science to see how it could tie to creative writing. And then what I looked at is speed of scene, which was just up there. We'll talk about that and give some examples. And then incident frequency, and then again, we'll give some examples. So time is vital. Had we done our experiment, we would have seen that we're pretty bad at it, but it's vital. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and when she was born, she would wake us up at various times. Why? Because she needed food. And then she would fall asleep. Why? Because she needed sleep. So babies are born with understanding time. But it's not just babies. I have a dog, and I feed her every morning at 6:30. So what does she do? Every morning at 5:30, she wakes me up. Why? Because she wants to get fed. So humans understand time and are born with it. Animals understand time and are born with it. Where I live in Vermont in America, our trees, they understand time. How do I know? Every fall they lose all their leaves, and then every spring they grow them back. Why? If they didn't, they know that they would die. So even trees understand time. So time is so vital that every living creature has some understanding of time. So, and time is so vital. If you look up here, any colored area is where time can be found in the brain. It can be found all over, and if we look, it can compare durations. It can manipulate time. It can form predictions like I was going to have you do. It can help estimate time and do short-term time, long-term time. So it's super important, and it's spread all throughout the brain. According to one neuroscientist, Dr. Bilger, the brain can track seconds, minutes, days, and weeks. It can set off alarms in the mornings, at bedtime, on birthdays and anniversaries, except for my father. He forgets every single birthday. In lab tests, people can distinguish sounds as little as 5 milliseconds apart. And our involuntary time, our response time is even quicker. So again, we have this deep understanding of time. So now, there's a famous neuroscientist called David Eagleman. And David Eagleman knew that humans, in certain moments, in moments of danger, time slows. Maybe you've experienced that, where it feels as if you're in a moment of danger and time lasts much longer. So Eagleman had a question. His question was, does time actually slow, or does it feel like it's slow? And my guess is most of us would say it feels like it slows and does not actually slow. So what Eagleman did is he created a test to discover if he was right. And what he did is he built a 5-story tower. At the bottom, he put a net. And at the very top, he had a trap door. And he had people stand on that trap door. And then he put a stopwatch on their wrists. And this stopwatch went a little bit faster than people could perceive. So if they looked at it, it was just a blur. They could not even see numbers. And then he told them, look at this watch and never stop looking at the watch. And then while they're standing on the trap door 5 stories up, when they didn't know it, he would open the trap door and they would fall down, feeling as if they were going to die, into that net. And if they did their jobs, they looked at that stopwatch, and if time actually slowed, they would see the numbers. If time did not slow, it would remain a blur. It remained a blur, so he was the first person that I know of and that he knew of that proved that time does not actually slow. It's not that surprising, but it was important to discover that. So once he figured that out, he started to wonder, okay, if time appears to slow, what causes that? So once again, we know that we need time to survive, but our perception of time, as I was hoping to show you all, it widely varies. So time can screech to a halt when we're really bored, or time can fly by like it has been for me here at the festival. So though time is a universal construct, our perception of time is faulty and a part of our brains. All right, we can go to the next one. So what Eagleman discovered is that time gets affected in the brain in a few major ways. It's going to get affected by fight or flight, which we'll talk about in a moment, novel experiences, and then altered states. And we'll look into all of those. So with fight or flight, these are those moments when we feel as if we're in danger. These are those moments where our physical lives are at risk or our emotional lives. So it's any of those moments. And Eagleman and many other neuroscientists suspect that time appears to slow because it's evolutionary beneficial. What are we trying to do? We're trying to survive. So what happens is, this is according to Eagleman, the amygdala, a part of the brain, it kicks into high gear, commanding the resources of the rest of the brain and forcing everything to attend to the situation at hand. The more detailed the memory, the longer the moment seems to last. So the amygdala steals all the resources and makes the brain work a lot faster, so everything feels as if it's going much slower. And then Dr. Falk, another neuroscientist, says, because of the threatening situation, my internal physiological processes speed up, and so relative to that, the outside world appears to slow down. So everything goes faster. Again, from Eagleman, when the amygdala gets involved, not only do our brains work at a higher level, but our memories are laid down in a way which provides the later flashbulb memories of post-traumatic stress disorder. So in dire situations, our brain may lay down memories in a way that makes them stick better. Upon replay, the higher density of data would make the event appear to last longer. So what we have is the brain brings in more information, that's part one. Part two, that makes the memories seem like they last longer, that's part two. And then part three, they're recorded in a way that in the most powerful moments comes back as PTSD. And why does the brain do all this? Again, just to survive. So that's the first example we have. And our next slide will show two pictures. We'll get it up there in a second. There we go. This picture is our brains on a normal day. Picture anyone who has a cheap cell phone. And your cell phone takes photos, but it doesn't take very good photos. If you're moving at a high rate of speed, it gets blurry. If it's a little dark, it gets blurry. That's our brains in a normal moment. This is our brains in fight or flight moments. It has a macro lens. It has a telescopic lens. Again, why? Because we need to survive in those moments. So what I want to do is I want to give you an example of fight or flight from one of my favorite books, Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. So this is from one of his essays, Havasu. And back in 1949, Abbey wandered down Havasu Canyon, which is a tight, narrow canyon in Arizona, and he would lower himself over these little cliffs, landing in water below. And then Abbey writes, he drops off one and he writes, "I hit rock bottom hard, but without any physical injury. I swam the stinking pond, doggy paddle, pushing the heavy scum away from my face, and crawled out of the far side to see what my face was going to be. Fatal. Death by starvation, slow and tedious, for I was looking straight down on an overhanging cliff to a rubble pile of broken rocks 80 feet below." So Abbey finds himself caught on the edge of this waterfall with a fall to the depth below and no way that he knows of to climb to the pool above. For the next page, Abbey writes about his ideas on how to escape, screaming for help, tearing his clothes into strips, building a signal fire. Once he realizes that none of those will work, he tries to scale the wall. We're back to Abbey now. Here, I was able to climb upwards a few centimeters at a time by bracing myself against the opposite side and finding sufficient niches for my fingers and toes. Somehow, with the skill and tenacity I never could have found in myself under ordinary circumstances, I managed to creep straight up that gloomy cliff and over the brink of the drop-off and into the flower of safety. I discovered myself bawling again for the third time in 3 hours, the hot, delicious tears of victory, and up above the clouds replied thunder. Abbey published Havasu and Desert Solitaire in 1968, which was 20 years after his near-death experience. Yet Abbey's recollection is pristine and seared into his memory. Abbey elongates these moments, stuck on that cliff, for nearly 5 full pages. I only read one, to highlight the power of fight or flight in these moments. So you could skip over the next slide. If we had time, we could do a writing prompt. The second way we misinterpret time is with novel experiences. To many of you, this is a very non-novel experience. I just arrived in Kerala on Wednesday morning, I think, and I've never been to India, never been to Kerala, and everything was new to me. The driving, the food, a lot of the languages, the accents. So for me, everything is a novel experience, including the architecture. And what this does is this forces our brains again to work harder. And an example of this is they talk about how as you get older, time appears to fly, where when you're younger, it seems to last much longer. And this is because of novel and non-novel experiences. My 7-year-old daughter went to school last year for the first time, and her first day of school was terrifying for her. Maybe you remember that. Her first week was terrifying. Her first month was terrifying. She finally now, as a first grader, feels confident. Next slide, please. And all this is because of novel and non-novel experiences. I would ask you, can you remember your first day of elementary school or college or high school? Can you remember the first time you met your future husband or wife? Can you remember the first time you lost a loved one? And my guess is the answer is yes. Now I'd ask, can you remember what you ate for breakfast 3 Wednesdays ago? I could tell you that I ate oatmeal, but the only reason I know that is because I eat oatmeal every Wednesday because my wife makes me. She's a good wife. She's keeping me nice and healthy. Otherwise, I have no idea why. Why? Because it's non-novel. And the way the brain works is if the brain only has so much storage. It's like a computer. And once the storage gets filled up, it starts wiping it out. And it determines if it's important or not by if you remember it. So if you don't use a memory in about 3 days, the brain says, oh, we don't need that information, and it starts wiping it out. So anything non-novel disappears, what you ate for breakfast 3 Wednesdays ago, but anything like a first date or first day of school sticks around. Why? Because the brain, again, is trying to survive. I'm going into that school for the first time. What do I do? Where is my classroom? Who is my teacher? If I have to go to the bathroom, where do I go? These are really important things to survive. Much like here, for me, how do I get to the festival? How do I find a taxi home? I've got to learn all of these things. So that's me or you on your first day of school, and that's about how many days I've been in school in my life. I'm up to something like 3,000 days. So every day kind of blends into the rest. They're all wonderful days. I love them, but they're very non-novel. So what does the brain do? It forgets them. I'm going to read an example of a novel and non-novel experience from Charles Bowden. This is from a devastatingly beautiful essay on humans and violence called Torch Song. And Bowden, at the beginning of Torch Song, introduces us to the first time he covers a violent crime as a newspaper reporter. This is Bowden. I can't tell much from her silhouette. She's sitting off to one side, her shoulders hunched, and towards the front is a box of teddy bears, or at least I think they're teddy bears. Almost 20 years have passed, and I've avoided thinking of it. There are some things that float pretty free of time, chronology, the book of history, and the lies of the experts. In the early 80s, I went to a motel where a child had been murdered. As part of my entry into this world, a kind of border crossing. It started as the golden light of afternoon poured through the high, slit white windows of the newsroom. I had no background in the business, and I'd lied to get the job. I was the fluff writer, the guy brought on to spin something out of nothing for the soft features. I was told to go to the motel and see if I could find anything to say. The motel I went to was a hot sheet joint with rooms by the hour or day, and featured water beds, in-room pornographic movies, and a flock of men and women. I walked around aimlessly inside the motel room, and I popped open the door of the old refrigerator, shelves empty, and then the little door to the freezer where 2 bottles of Budweiser, frozen solid, nestled, as if someone with a powerful thirst had placed them to chill in a hurry and then had been distracted. I heard the woman's voice in my ear explain how the mother had gone to work. She danced at a strip club, and then we'll end there. So what we get there is a really novel and devastating experience, and Bowden goes into a lot of details, and I've cut out quite a few. Later in Torch Song, by the end, Bowden has lived for years on the edge of this world of violence and deviancy and sex. He's lived in a world where reporting on violence becomes an everyday occurrence. These brutal moments lose all their power for him, rather than these, and then Bowden falls deeper and deeper into a world of deviancy himself. And rather than these deviant moments gaining power, like they did in the beginning, they lose all their power. And by the end, Bowden very quickly writes about all of these women coming and going from his life in single lines with no details. Why? Because it's like that screen, a couple of ones, it's happened so much that he forgets about it. He barely describes his experience because his world has transitioned from novel to non-novel. In the end, all the details are blurred together because they no longer matter. All right, we can skip the next slide, please. All right. The final way that the brain misperceives time is altered states. There's a lot of different ways that the brain can have an altered state. We can use drugs or alcohol. Cocaine and meth will make us overestimate how long an event takes, while depressants like alcohol or marijuana may think an event goes more quickly. Psychoactive drugs like LSD or mescaline can alter how we perceive times in all sorts of ways. They can speed up, slow down, or become completely out of sequence. We also have brain traumas, dementia, brain injuries, chemotherapy, deliriums, and other medical conditions that affect how we perceive time. And then there's psychological issues, fatigue, worry, and anxiety, and also spiritual moments. So any of those can make us misperceive time. And we'll look at, next slide, please, an example from Jessica Hendry Nelson. She is a co-author of one of my textbooks and a great friend of mine. She wrote a beautiful book, If Only You People Could Follow Directions. And in this book, in one scene, the book's about her father's death and her brother's addiction. And in this scene, she and her brother Jordan are drinking wine and snorting Ritalin. This is Jess talking. We sit quietly smoking, and I feel my thoughts begin to trip over one another, my heart racing. I watch the old clock flipping through those arbitrary numbers, and it seems so loud, that clicking. Jordan reaches over and he covers that clock with a blanket. It goes silent, and we soon realize it's not the same as time stopping. Soon it's 2:30 a.m. and Jordan is crying as his friend Angel visits. Then time passes in one big leap. Here I am, and that sun, which isn't here yet, could show up at any moment unannounced, as it tends to do. The world will start up, its endless, painstaking rotations, and all the people will get out of bed. Oh my gosh, I say. Do you know what that means? It means it's late, really late at night, and the sun will come up soon. I can't bear to see the sun. I hate the freaking sun. And in this section, we get a scene that moves and jumps and starts. It lingers in moments, and then it stretches out, and then it contracts as time leaps forward. From evening to the middle of the night to morning. And this is all because of the drug and alcohol use. So that's another way we can misperceive time. So now what we've done is shown the 3 ways that the brain can misperceive time. And now, next slide, please. We're going to start talking about, next slide again, please, how we can use this as creative writers, as storytellers. So we know the ways that we can misperceive time. And now what I want to talk about is what we should focus on. And we should focus on those moments that affect how the brain misperceives time. Since those are the moments that were rich enough and powerful enough to make the brain do all that extra work, to make the brain record those memories richer, to make the brain force us to remember it over and over, even if we don't want to. And these are the moments that the reader wants us to linger on. They want to linger on the same moments that keep us up at night, the same moments that force us to write our stories, whether it's our stories or the novels or poems we write about others. So we want to focus on writing about fight or flight, novel experiences, or altered states. And how do we do that? All right, next slide. We're going to talk about speed of scene, and I'm going to go through this one step at a time. We can go to the next slide. All right, pop quiz. You will get graded on this. How many senses do humans have? I see 5, right? I asked my daughter just yesterday, I practiced this with her over WhatsApp, and she said taste, sight, hearing, smell. I think she got smell. She didn't get touch. She said the brain. And I said, no, but that's interesting. So we have our 5 senses, but we actually have a lot more. If anyone was standing up, I would tell you to stand up, lift a foot off the ground. Oh, let's see if I can do this. And touch my nose. I'm doing 2 other senses, a sense of balance and proprioception. If anyone is hot, that's another sense. If anyone is thirsty, like me, that's another sense. If anyone is sitting here squirming because you have to go to the bathroom, that's another sense. We have a lot more than 5 senses. I think we've determined we have maybe 21 senses. And what we want to do is in those most important moments, those novel moments, those fight or flight moments, and sometimes those altered state moments, we want to use those 21 senses we have to bring the reader right into the experience. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can go through a bunch. There we go. So we're going to talk about speed of scene. And this is There's 5 speeds of scene, and we'll talk about each of them one at a time. Next slide, thank you. All right, gaps. You all know gaps. You might know it by a different term, but this is just where there's holes in a story. This is where we jump over events. I flew from Montreal to Bangalore, and sorry, I'll try to stay here. And I got on the plane in Montreal, and more or less, I got off the plane here in Kerala. Do you need any more information? No. So what do? I gap right over it. I leave it right behind. This is the fastest version of a scene, and I'm going to read you a very short example of a gap. This is from Eric Ries and his beautiful book, Lost Mountain. This is about a mountain that gets eaten up completely by a mining company. In 1912, the railroad had finally reached McRoberts, a small hamlet that sits near the headwaters of the Kentucky River's North Fork. The northern coal barons had been waiting for decades to get at the minerals in the Cumberland Highlands, and once the tracks were laid, they quickly threw up coal camps along the narrow valley floor. Elkhorn Coal built nearly 100 4-over-4 houses about 10 feet from either side of the only road that leads to McRoberts. 2 families lived in each house. There was no indoor plumbing. Today, many of those company houses are still standing. So what Eric Ries does is he goes from 1912 to today in one sentence. Why? Because we don't need any more information. It doesn't matter. These are non-novel experiences, non-fight or flight moments, so Eric Ries just gets rid of them. So we get rid of the things we don't care about. Next slide. Summary, you also know summary very well. This is where we condense something. Why do we summarize versus gap? We do it because we need it as a bridge, but for nothing else. So an example on the next slide will be Jane Allison's book, The Sister Antipodes. So we have Jane going to dinner in D.C., Washington, D.C., with her former stepfather, Paul. Paul asks Jane how her mother, Paul's former wife, is doing. And here, Allison shifts us from scene into summary. Another pause and jingle of ice. Another shift of subject. Your mother, asks Paul, is she still seeing what's his name, Phil, Bill? Jane says thinks she probably was. Phil or Bill or Bob or Ken or some John or another. Men pulled up in their white Cadillacs on Fridays and Saturdays and took her out to dinner at Piccadilly's, and she would dance all night long. So in this excerpt, Allison begins in scene, but then moves to summarize all of her mother's dates. And why does she do this? Allison could have stayed there and introduced us to each one of them. But rather than doing that, we don't need to know any of them. We just need to know there's a blur of men coming and going, so she summarizes all of them. Once again, non-novel, we just need that information to move on. All right, next slide. So we have scene, and the way I think a scene is it lasts as long on the page as it lasts for the real moment. So a scene feels like real time. You all know scene, you've lived in scene, you've written scene, and we'll give a short example. This is from Joy Castro's Island of the Bone. Joy is trying to convince her mother not to remarry. We've got a lot of dark pieces here. Sorry about that. All right, this is Joy. I cry in my mother's room as she dresses, begging her not to do it, but I have no evidence aside from the weird way she looks at us. She's patient for a while, going over the money he makes, the good reputation he has in his congregation, but finally she turns on me. So that was all summary. I'm just fed up with you, you hear? Do you understand me? I've just about had it with your belly aching. She swings her hairbrush in my face. Why do you always want to ruin everything? Why? One good thing comes along, something that'll actually make me happy for once, and you start your whining, as usual. So Castro moves from summary, where we just need to understand what's going on, to scene, where it gets much more vital, and she slows way down there. Again, you use a lot of scene all the time. All right, now we're going to get to where I think it really matters, where the brain science really comes back. So remember, what's happening in our fight and flight and novel moments especially is the brain speeds up, takes in more information, and records them better. So this is where we use dilation. We use it in those most important moments. And we're going to look at an example, next slide, from Charles Finn. And he's in a fight or flight moment where he sees a cougar. If you don't know what a cougar is, it's a mountain lion, which is America's versions of lions, or maybe more closely like a tiger. And pay attention, he's going to have a tiger or a mountain lion right near him. And this scene is going to last 1 second, 1/1000. That's how long. So a scene, if we were to write a scene, should last about that long. And this is how long Charles Finn writes it. The cougar stops and stands in profile. Large chamomile eyes swivel and loop up into mine. Its tail is drooped in an elongated S, shoulders rounded above the sweep of its back. Powder puff ears turn towards me, and its face is centered around the pink heart of a nose. I can make out the thick lines of its whiskers, also the indent on lips pulled back in their perpetual smile. The cougar lifts its head and dignity oils its fur. It raises a boxing glove paw as if in greeting. And I know my one wish above all others is to spend time with one of these cats, to hold and to pet one, to hear one of them purr. The cougar sets its paw down, a head in the snow. It lifts the other. So once again, we had a 1 second moment. And Charles Finn took 9 sentences to describe it. And I don't know how long it took me to read, 30 seconds. So what he's doing is he's dilating this fight or flight moment, this novel experience. Why? Because it affected his brain so much. All right, next slide. All right. So immediately after a dilated moment, a fight or flight moment, a novel moment, immediately after I get into the taxi to start driving to the festival and I enter the traffic, in America we drive very differently than here. You all have this beautiful poetry on the road, and it's so different from where I live. Where I live, we follow the rules, or if we break them in one burst. And if someone breaks the rules, we get really angry if they break them. If I break them, I don't get angry, but everyone will get angry at me. Here, it seems like everyone breaks all the rules, but everyone understands that. And again, it's this wonderful poetry. So I get in the taxi starts driving, and the first thing I think is, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. And then I realize I'm not going to die, and then I think, oh no, yes I am. And then I survive that one, and then I say I'm going to die, and I say, no, I'm not. And then after those moments, what do? What do we all do? We get into our brains. And immediately I start trying to process what is going on. How does my driver know how to drive when I have no idea? And I start getting into my brain, and we can go to the next slide. This is what I call internal scene, and this is where we go into our own brains. And to me, this is really important. After every important moment in our lives, we fall into our brains. Why? Because we're human. Why? Because we need to survive. Why? Because we want to know how to do better next time. So with internal scene, we can get into our brains in 3 major ways. We can use reflection. This is where we look backwards on an event. We can use introspection so we can check in how we're doing. How am I doing? Okay, I'm alive. I'm doing okay. Or we can do speculation. And speculation is where we either look into the past. How could I have done that better or differently? Oh, I could have said that to him or her. Or we could speculate into the future. When I'm older, I'm going to become an X or a Y. When I was 6 years old, my daughter asked me what I wanted to be when I was her age, and I think it was a garbage man. So I was speculating. That's what I want to do in my future. So after any dilated moment, what we want to do is we want to use internal reflection. And we'll look at a scene, next slide, please, of internal scene from Joe Wilkins. Joe Wilkins is a spectacular writer and one of my very best friends. And here, Joe visits a guy named Ed Dempsey to get a bottle of scent from a coyote to help capture other coyotes. Ed Dempsey is as big as a bear, but slumpy and pudgy and bald. He has turned his big body away from me and is studying the rows of shelves along the far wall. He takes a long time. I stare at the stubbly back of his neck, his shoulders rising with breath. He must be remembering. So that's where we enter Joe's brain as he's going to enter Ed's brain. For the shelves are not labeled, and neither are the glass bottles that crowd each shelf. Some great, some brown, some purple, some with droppers for lids, some with burnt driftwood corks. I imagine he enjoys remembering. I imagine there is a story that explains each one, which ridge and what kind of coyote and how the rain came. These are Ed's blue glass stories, these bottles and vials. He considers first this one and then that one, the glass clinking like small bells as he thumbed through them. I don't care how long this takes, how long he spends remembering, I'll wait. And here we get Joe thinking. Why? Because it's a novel experience. And he's getting right into his brain. And then he's getting, or at least trying to get into Ed's brain, trying to understand what Ed will do. So for our creative writing, what we could do is in those important moments, we can use dilation, or we should use dilation, and then internal scene, because that's what made us, that's what affected our brains the most, and that's what will affect our readers the most. All right, next slide. All right, the next idea I want to talk about is speed of scene. Oh, no. All right, you can go to the next slide. Is incident of scene. There's 3 of these. 2 you know well, so we'll just skim right over them. You might never have heard of these terms, but you'll know the first 2 very well. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, we have the normative. And this is where there's 1 event in real life and 1 event on the page, or 5 events in real life, 5 events on the page. So I've come to India once in my life. If I were to write about it, and I wrote about it once, it would be the normative. Pretty simple. If I did something 5 times and I wrote about it 5 times, once again, the normative. We use this all the time. Next slide. We have the iterative. This is another one you've used all the time. Maybe you have or have not heard this term, but the iterative is where we've done many incidents, gone to school many, many times, but we distill it down to 1 or 2 or 3 events. So if I were to write an essay about being a professor, I've been on campus thousands of days, but maybe I'll write about 5 of those days. All the rest are non-novel. I can get rid of them. So I choose the most important ones, and that's the iterative, where we take a lot and boil it down to a few. You use that all the time in your writing. Next slide, please. Now here's where I think brain science gets most useful, and this is the repetitive. And I think this is the one we use the least and the one we think about the least. And this is where we have, let's say, 1 experience, but we come back to it time and time and time again in our brains or on the page. And I think as writers, we can use this a lot more. Why? Because this is where often the PTSD-related moments, those fight or flight-related moments, those novel experiences that either haunt us or give us, wonderful feelings. So I think about my marriage to my wife plenty. And then there's some terrifying things that we think about as well. So the normative is another positive one. All right, so I'm going to give you our last example, and this is of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carry, an amazing novel. If you haven't read it, it's a great novel, and it's also a great craft book on how to be a creative writer. It's brilliant. But we have a narrator, we'll call him Tim, and Tim is in the Vietnam War, and he's writing about or remembering a moment when one of his soldiers died. And you'll see that he repeats it over and over again. So this one does it for me. I've told it before many times, many versions, but here's what actually happened. We crossed that river and marched west into the mountains. On the 3rd day, Kurt Lemon stepped on a booby-trapped 105 round. He was playing catch with Rat Keeley, laughing. and then he was dead. A few pages later, the narrator says, "This one wakes me up. In the mountains that day, I watched Lemon turn sideways. He laughed and said something to Rat Keeley. Then he took a peculiar half step, moving from shade, and then he was blown into a tree." Sorry. 20 minutes later, well, I'll skip over that part because I'm running out of time. But what he does over and over again is he just repeats this death scene. Why? Because it haunts him. Why? Because he wants to understand it. Why? Because he wants to survive. This is what his brain was doing in that moment, so he puts it on the page, and it powerfully moves us. So next slide. Next slide. So once again, time is a part of all of us. And in those moments of fight or flight, or those moments of novel experiences, our brain is transformed. We remember things differently. And as writers, as storytellers, what we need to do is dilate and use internal scene, and then use the repetitive so that our readers literally feel what we went through, so they're moved by our stories. Thank you so much.
Very nice listening to you today. So my first question is about the perception of time. So you said that time, it can either, you can speed it up or you can dilate it, but is there another perception of time? For example, in the West, you have a linear version of time, and in certain Eastern cultures, we have a more cyclical view of time, where the seasons come and go, and we face the same situation again and again till we learn from it. So do you think that also impacts writing?
Yes. So I run a textbook series, and one of the things we've worked really hard is to create textbooks that are not just Western focused, because where I'm from, we tell stories in a similar kind of way. And I enjoy those stories, and I enjoy teaching in those ways, but there's so many other different ways. So we have a book on Asian short stories. Why? Because we don't want our American textbooks, unless you choose to be taught in Asia, because we don't want to say our stories are the right ways to tell stories. And we're hoping to do a Southeast Asia one and an African one and others written by people from those regions, because just like as you're talking about, there's so many different ways to tell stories. All of them are beautiful, all of them are right. So I completely agree. Where I live on a lake, and every single day I record the temperature and the weather and any interesting natural thing that occurs. And each year I can go back 10 years and look what occurred that previous day for a lot of the same reasons you're talking about, because I want to learn. Is our lake melting sooner? Is it hotter earlier? All of those things. But I love that idea, and yes, all of those play right into it.
So the second question is, you talked about novelty and how you can use it to get the attention of the reader. But in our age of overstimulation, do you think if we have too much novelty, we won't pay attention to the details? We might just skim over it?
Hold on a sec. I just got to check my social media for a second. What was that? It would have been a lot funnier had I gotten it out quicker. But so we could do multiple things. Again, there's so many different ways to tell stories. I could write a story where the narrator is just overstimulated. And I see more and more TV shows and more books where social media, where cell phones, where the World Wide Web is all a part of the book, and they're mirroring more of that world. Or we can, if we want to, we could maybe go and really slow down time and bore the reader, but I worry then if we do too much of that, we're going to lose it. But I think what I would say is experiment, play with it. It's very easy to maybe overdo it and make it so the reader can't. It's too fractured. But I love the idea of experimenting with that and seeing how we can play with this new world we live in, because it's our world.
It's important to look at time from the science point of view, but at the same time, when you look at time only from the science point of view, my time and your time is different.
Yes.
So the time from an African kid is different from a Finnish kid. And the time in the, what you call the main centers of New York is different from downtown. So time for all of us is different. And we are talking about time, which is the most stubborn illusion, as per Einstein. So when we look at time and reduce it, like as a tool for writing, the whole other thing, what art is trying to incorporate into time, like many other factors, will it be reduced? So the same problem science always have. It tried to cut off things. Art is trying and the other way. So when we are going to look at time, like when we look at a patient, like one patient from the brain point of view, like a doctor who has experienced what you call, say, cerebral some hemorrhage. She is telling that I have forgotten the time that I have to tell between two letters. So what you are telling is the whole creative experience is a harmony or something that is created between endocrine system and neurology. Isn't it reducing the whole thing? Because the most important thing is not inside the brain. What is happening outside is also important. We are trying to give a representation of the social situation outside, which art is trying to do. So when you look at the science point of view, we are only focusing on the inside. It's a critical angle of the same thing. I appreciate the whole thing, but at the same time, when you look at and leave the art part and only focus on the science part, you got my idea, or are we missing something?
What was the last thing you said?
I said, when you look at time as a brain event, aren't we missing what we try to do in creativity? Like we are only trying to create a model inside your brain. We are actually trying to represent an outside social reality through art.
So I think this might answer your question. Kant, the philosopher, had this idea of the noumenal and the phenomenal. And I think I'm going to get this right. The noumenal is the world as it is. So there's a real world. But no human, he would argue, can access the real world. Why? Because our brains are stuck inside here. And the only way those brains can see the outside world is through those 21 senses. So we've got a real world out there, and we've got a brain in here, and our stories are coming from in here, trying to connect to your brain and your brain and your brain. So we're doing this weird thing of my little brain trying to connect to other brains. And the other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to tell a story through our phenomenal experience, through the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, all those senses, trying to make sense of it. So everything gets distorted. So to talk about art and science, I don't really see a difference between the two. And maybe that's just because my brain is my unique brain. But to me, science is beautiful when it's artful. And art is beautiful when there's some sort of logic. That doesn't mean it needs to be logical, but the artist has some logic for what they're doing. So I see them as connected, but we need art. And if you write just from science, then you're missing half or more. So, yeah, I love your idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
I can't hear what you're saying, but...
Like we do in the...
You have to speak close.
Like we do in Zen and Art of Motorcycle Mechanism, that book tried to connect those interconnections. Like there is always creativity in art, like V.S. Ramachandran does in Phantoms in the Brain. He tried to study what is the science of creativity. You have touched some part, like that flight or fight, that is creating an impression. But when you enjoy a poetry, is there flight or fight working there? Like we want to repeat. I want to repeat again and again. I want to read the opening of Macbeth. Like when will we three meet again, in summer, lightning, or in rain? I am actually repeating it. I want to hear it again and again, but there is no flight or fight. And it is not even connected to me. I haven't seen the Three Witches.
So I could not, with the fan, it's hard.
No. I am telling, actually, the opening stanza of Shakespearean poetry, which I haven't experienced. Yeah. But something inside that is being, pulling me again and again to read that creativity. So you are telling that if there is a flight or a fight thing, that will be making an impression inside the brain. Isn't it that an animalistic, like, because human beings are more than animals, isn't it? Are we reducing human beings into animal models? As we said that we have to see these animal model idea is there in science, because I don't know, I'm not sure about whether an animal will cry for Quincy when he hear Quincy, will it dance?
I could hear you much better. I'm so thankful for that. So I would say I am an animal.
Yeah.
So a lot of me is animalistic, and I would also say that a lot of animals are wildly
But
intelligent.
we are higher cognitive animals.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
We think and we look at ourselves.
Yes.
We know that we exist.
Yeah.
We have a sense of morality that is very different from animals.
Maybe. I'm not positive about that. I would like to say we're a lot smarter than animals, but we are animals, and I know some really smart animals. But going back to what I think you said about fight or flight, there's also the novel experiences. When I read a beautiful poem, a James Wright poem, and it moves me, it doesn't move me because of the fear. It moves me because James Wright has taken me to some new spot that I've never been, that I've never experienced, and it moves me emotionally. So that would be maybe the novel experience, or maybe it alters my state, a spiritual moment. I read that poem and I'm transported to some new spot. It could be through religion or some other spiritual thing, but at least for me, it doesn't always have to be that.
Thank you. It's time for us.
We could talk after. I'm going to hang out.
It's time for us
All
to
right.
conclude.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you, Santosh sir.